The old hotel loomed before us, a crumbling monument against the fading sky. Its windows, shattered and dark, seemed to swallow what little light was left. We had heard about this place for years, whispers about its haunted halls and the strange things seen and heard here. The stories always felt like folklore, local legends meant to spook anyone curious enough to get too close. But now, standing at the entrance, I could feel an unease that those stories hadn't captured. This wasn't just a creepy old building, it felt alive in some strange way, as if it watched and waited. The three of us, Simon, Julian, and me, stood in silence, taking in the grim sight before us. My hands felt clammy despite the cool air, and a slight breeze rustled through the trees, brushing the overgrown grass around our feet. The evening shadows stretched long, casting thin fingers of darkness over the chipped bricks and broken doors. I knew Simon and Julian felt it too, though neither said a word. It was the sort of place that weighed on you, a lingering sense of being somewhere we shouldn't be, as if we were trespassing on a space that still held on to its past in some quiet, twisted way. We stepped through the threshold, our footsteps loud against the silence. Inside, the air was stale and thick, like a breath held too long. Dust coated everything, undisturbed for years, and the walls bore faded remnants of wallpaper, now peeling away in strips like forgotten skin. Shadows clung to the corners, and each step we took echoed, sending soft, unsettling reverberations through the empty corridors. We moved slowly, taking it all in, the thrill of discovery mingling with a quiet dread that grew heavier with each step. It wasn't long before the silence of the place shifted. At first I thought it was just the sound of our own movements, boots scraping against the dusty floor or the soft rustle of our jackets as we moved. But then it became clear. There was something else, a faint, muffled sound that didn't belong to us. The noise was soft, almost like a whisper, threading through the walls, lingering just beyond our hearing. I could tell that Simon and Julian heard it too. They exchanged glances, expressions tense, listening as intently as I was. The whispers seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I couldn't make out any words, just that haunting cadence, like a conversation happening on the other side of the walls, out of sight but somehow all around us. The sound would fade, leaving us with our own ragged breathing, only to return stronger, closer, as if urging us to keep going, pulling us deeper into the darkened corridors. We followed the sound without speaking, winding our way through the narrow hallways, the air growing colder and more stifling with each turn. It was as though the whispers themselves had a presence, an invisible guide luring us into the heart of the hotel. And despite the unease gnawing at me, curiosity kept me moving forward. Whatever lay at the end of this path, it was something that had waited long enough to be found. We came upon a door at the end of one of the hallways, slightly ajar. The whispers had grown louder here, as if they were pouring out from behind the door itself. Simon pushed it open, and we stepped inside. Immediately, an oppressive stillness filled the room. It was smaller than the other rooms, but every inch of the walls was covered with scratches and words, marks left by frantic hands. Desperate messages carved into the plaster, pleas etched in thin, jagged letters. Some were simple, words like help and save me. Others were longer, sentences trailing off as if the writer hadn't finished or had been interrupted. A chill settled over me, the hairs on my arms standing up as I read the messages. I tried to imagine the people who had scratched those words, what kind of terror had driven them to leave these silent cries behind. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Simon and Julian were silent beside me, eyes wide as they took in the grim messages, their faces pale in the dim light. In the center of the floor, our flashlights revealed a large dark hole. The opening was crude, as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to the floor and broken through to whatever lay beneath. My stomach twisted at the sight. The darkness within seemed alive, an empty void that beckoned us forward, though every instinct screamed to turn back. But we were too deep in now, curiosity overriding caution. After a brief hesitation, we began our descent. I went first, gripping the edges of the hole, lowering myself down with shaky hands. The drop was steep, and when my feet hit solid ground, I found myself in what seemed like an old sewer tunnel. The walls were damp, covered in a thin sheen of moisture, and the air was even heavier here, carrying a damp, metallic smell that clung to my lungs with every breath. Simon and Julian followed, and soon we were all standing in the narrow passage, our flashlights casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The space was claustrophobic, each sound amplified tenfold. The drip of water, the scrape of our boots, even our breathing seemed loud and intrusive. We moved slowly, our steps echoing into the unknown darkness, each one bringing with it a heightened awareness of the oppressive silence that enveloped us. But then, as we ventured deeper, I felt a shift. It wasn't just the air, it was something else, a sensation of being watched, like unseen eyes followed us from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling, each step bringing a growing sense of dread, but we were too far in to turn back. The sewers twisted and turned, a maze that seemed to swallow us whole. I tried to push down the fear gnawing at my chest, focusing instead on the path ahead, knowing that whatever lay beyond, we would have to face it together. The deeper we went, the darker and narrower the tunnels became, until they were little more than cramped corridors barely wide enough for us to walk single file. Every sound was amplified here, each shuffle and scrape bouncing off the damp walls, surrounding us in an echo chamber of our own movement. But then, somewhere in the stillness, a new sound emerged, a faint shuffling behind us. At first, I thought it was just the distorted echo of our own footsteps. But it wasn't in sync with our steps. It was its own rhythm, dragging softly across the ground, as if something or someone was keeping pace just out of sight. Simon, ahead of me, glanced back, his face pale in the dim glow of the flashlight. His expression mirrored my own creeping fear. Julian, too, was breathing faster, his shoulders tense as he scanned the tunnel behind us. I tried to convince myself it was just the building, the old pipes or settling framework, something rational. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, with an unsettling regularity that defied logic. We quickened our pace, hoping to shake whatever was back there. But the shuffling kept on, matching our every move, and the sense of being watched intensified, pressing in on us from every side, as though the walls themselves were alive, observing, waiting for something we couldn't see. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, but dread gnawed at me, every instinct screaming that we were not alone down here. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the periphery of my vision, quick but unmistakable. I turned, but there was nothing, just darkness and silence. But then the shadow returned, closer this time, just out of reach but distinctly there, lurking in the narrow passage behind us. Panic surged through me as I realized it was more than just a trick of the light. It was a figure, a dark, silent presence that stayed just beyond the beam of our flashlights, moving with a speed that made my skin crawl. The three of us broke into a run, the narrow tunnel echoing with our frantic footsteps. We turned corner after corner, the sewers twisting in disorienting directions, every passage looking more like the last. I could hear the others breathing heavily, our fear palpable, a silent understanding passing between us that we needed to escape, now. But the shadow didn't relent. No matter how fast we ran, it was there, always in our peripheral vision, a silent pursuer that loomed closer with each step. My heart pounded, my hands cold with fear as we twisted through the labyrinthine tunnels. I could feel the air growing colder, the walls seeming to close in, and the sense of impending doom gnawed at me with a primal, unyielding grip. We had to find a way out, but every turn only seemed to take us deeper. After what felt like hours of blind running, I finally saw it, the faint outline of the hole we'd climbed through, a small patch of distant light in the suffocating darkness. Relief surged through me, mingled with sheer terror, as I realized that our pursuer was still there, following, an unwavering presence that had no intention of letting us go. Simon reached the hole first, scrambling up with a desperation I'd never seen. He pulled himself out, his face drenched in sweat, and then Julian followed, clawing his way up with trembling hands. I was the last to climb, feeling the cold air at my back as I pulled myself up, my arms straining against the fear and exhaustion. As I climbed, I couldn't resist glancing back one last time, and what I saw rooted me in horror. The shadowy figure was there, standing motionless in the darkness, staring up at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence felt suffocating, a weight that I could feel even from above. I forced myself to look away, pulling myself out and collapsing on the floor next to the others, my heart hammering as if it would burst. Without a word, we pushed a heavy box over the hole, our hands shaking as we blocked the entrance to the place we just escaped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our ragged breaths as we sat there, each of us trying to process what we just witnessed. But there was no sense to be made of it, only the haunting knowledge that something had followed us, something we couldn't explain. We staggered out of the hotel, our legs weak and unsteady, the cold night air sharp against our skin. The world outside felt distant, disconnected from the horror we had just escaped. As I looked back at the hotel, its dark outline against the night sky, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. It started on a regular weekday afternoon. I'd been going about my business, half lost in routine, when a sudden knock at the door startled me out of my thoughts. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and something about the sound felt oddly out of place. There was a strange sense of weight behind it, like whoever was on the other side was more than just eager, they were insistent. I opened the door to see a man standing there, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it belonged to another era. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, obscuring his features until he tilted his head up slightly. His gaze was intense, unsettlingly so, as if he was studying every detail about me, as if he knew something I didn't. In one hand, he held a small briefcase, worn at the edges, its leather cracked and faded. He introduced himself, though his name slipped away as quickly as he said it, and began to speak about his business. I barely listened, focusing instead on his face, his eyes, a shade too bright, too focused. Something about him felt wrong, though I couldn't place exactly what it was. He insisted on coming inside, saying he had something important to discuss, but I declined, telling him I wasn't interested. Despite his smile, his eyes hardened for a brief moment before he nodded, turning to leave. As he walked down the steps, he looked back, not at me but at my house, his gaze lingering on the front windows, as if memorizing the details. I closed the door, unsettled, brushing it off as nothing more than an overly persistent salesman. But the memory of that stare, cold and invasive, lingered long after he was gone. Over the next few days, I thought I'd seen the last of him. But then, late one afternoon, I heard that same knock again, 3 slow, deliberate raps. I opened the door to find him standing there, dressed just as before, his hat and suit unchanging, his briefcase clutched in one hand. This time, he didn't introduce himself or mention what he was selling. He simply stared at me with that same unnerving intensity. I told him, more firmly this time, that I wasn't interested, and closed the door quickly, feeling a growing sense of discomfort. But it didn't end there. The next day, he returned, knocking with that same unyielding rhythm. Each time he came, his persistence grew. He barely mentioned his product. Instead, he seemed focused on gaining entry to my home, his tone almost pleading, but his eyes cold and calculated. Each time I refused, his eyes lingered a little longer on the house itself, his interest shifting from me to the place where I lived. After that, I started dreading the sound of knocking, each new visit unsettling me more than the last. The man's appearances had crossed from the realm of annoyance into something far darker, a feeling that rooted itself in the pit of my stomach. But still, I convinced myself he'd give up eventually, that whatever he wanted, he'd realize he wouldn't find it here. Then, the knocking stopped, but he didn't go away. It was almost worse now. Without warning, he would appear at various times, standing across the street, just watching. There were no more attempts to enter, no feigned pitches about his mysterious product. He simply watched, his gaze locked onto my house with an intensity that left me cold. Sometimes I'd see him in the early morning, partially hidden by the shadows, his face barely visible beneath the brim of that hat. Other times, he'd be there in the evening, a dark figure silhouetted against the streetlights, his posture unnervingly still. Days bled into nights, and his appearances became unpredictable, each one leaving me more unsettled than the last. I'd catch a glimpse of him through the window, only to look again and find him gone. The unease crept into my life, turning small sounds and faint shadows into constant reminders that he was out there, somewhere, always watching. The feeling of being observed became a constant weight pressing down on me, something I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. And still I never saw him arrive or leave, as if he was a part of the night itself. The turning point came late one night. I was jolted awake by a faint noise, a sound that was unmistakably out of place. I lay still, listening, straining to catch it again. Then it came, the soft crunch of footsteps moving slowly around the perimeter of my house, deliberate and measured, pausing near each window. My heart pounded, a cold dread settling over me as I realized he was out there, somewhere just beyond the walls. The footsteps circled the property, dragging out each step as if savoring the silence, lingering in the darkness, just out of sight. I stayed in bed, muscles tense, barely breathing as I listened, hoping he would leave. But instead, the sound grew closer, nearing the windows, stopping for a few moments before moving on. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my heart racing, unable to shake the image of his dark silhouette just beyond the curtains. The footsteps finally faded, disappearing into the stillness of the night, but the fear remained, heavy and suffocating. The next night he returned, and the night after that, each time drawing closer, his steps growing slower, more intentional, as if savoring his presence just outside my home. By then I knew it wasn't just paranoia. He was here for a reason, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be easily deterred. After another sleepless night spent listening to the relentless footsteps circling my home, I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. Each night had only strengthened my fear, driving me toward an inevitable decision. I spent the next morning installing security cameras around the property, setting them up to capture every angle, determined to uncover what exactly was happening outside my windows when the darkness settled. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even under the sun's light, my skin prickled with that familiar unease, as if his presence lingered in every shadow, every whisper of the wind. Once the cameras were in place, I tried to go about my day, attempting to distract myself, though the growing dread weighed down each passing hour. That night, as the clock neared midnight, I braced myself for the inevitable sounds, waiting with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. And as if on cue, the footsteps began, the slow, measured crunch of gravel just outside my window, each step deliberate, each pause lingering. I stayed still, heart pounding, letting the cameras do their work, hoping for the first time to see him captured by something other than my own haunted memory. By morning, I reviewed the footage, feeling my pulse quicken as I fast-forwarded through the night. And there he was, the salesman, pacing around the house, moving with a slow, unsettling rhythm, his gaze locked onto each window, each corner. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if he were inspecting each part of the house with some strange purpose. A chill crept over me as I watched him pause, his face tilted toward the camera for just a brief moment, his eyes glinting unnervingly in the dim light. The image was etched into my mind, a confirmation of my deepest fears. The footage was undeniable proof of the man's bizarre behavior, and I knew I couldn't handle this alone. With the recordings in hand, I drove to the police station, explaining everything: the salesman's repeated visits, his insistence on entering my house, and now his nightly surveillance. I could see the skepticism in the officer's eyes at first, but when he watched the footage, his expression shifted, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. They promised to investigate, reassuring me that they'd look into the man's identity and keep an eye on the neighborhood. I felt a slight wave of relief, like a weight had been lifted, knowing that someone else now understood the unsettling nature of my situation. But even as they assured me of their support, I couldn't shake the hollow feeling that had settled deep in my chest. This man's persistence felt too intense, too deliberate, as if he had some personal motive that no one else could grasp. I went home that night feeling both hopeful and deeply uneasy. The thought of him returning felt almost inevitable, as if he'd be waiting in the shadows, unfazed by any outside intervention. The cameras were set up, the police had been informed, but none of it could stop the nagging sense that his visits weren't about being caught or seen. They were about something more sinister. Days passed, and I watched each evening for any sign of him, waiting for the familiar knock, the footsteps, the shadowy figure across the street. But nothing came. The salesman had vanished, leaving behind an absence that felt like an open wound. Each night was silent, almost unnervingly so, and I found myself growing restless, watching the street, the yard, the cameras, expecting him to reappear at any moment. When the police followed up, they told me their investigation had turned up nothing. No name, no records, no evidence of any such person in the area. They assured me that if he was around, they'd find him, but their words offered little comfort. This wasn't just a man who decided to move on or disappear. It was as if he'd never existed at all, as if his visits had been some surreal nightmare that left no trace. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking just beyond sight. The silence of his absence felt too unnatural, too sudden, and the unease grew each day, amplifying my paranoia. Every sound outside, every creak of the floorboards at night, felt like a prelude to his return, a reminder that whatever his purpose, it was still unfinished. In the days that followed, I tried to move on, convincing myself that he was gone for good. I found the package on my doorstep on an otherwise ordinary morning. It was small, unremarkable, a simple brown box with no label, no return address, just a neatly sealed package as if it had simply appeared there. I figured it was some delivery mix-up, a neighbor's order accidentally left at my door, or something sent by mistake. I brought it inside, curiosity piquing just enough to make me open it. Inside was a single black feather, dark and glossy, resting on a folded sheet of paper. I unfolded the paper, half expecting a note, some explanation for the strange gift. But there was nothing, just a blank page, pristine and untouched. I held the feather in my hand, its weight barely there, an odd sensation creeping up my spine as I looked at it. Shrugging it off, I threw both the feather and the paper away, deciding it was probably a prank or some sort of random joke. But the image of that feather stuck with me throughout the day, a small sliver of unease lodging itself in my mind. Even as I moved on, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for me, a silent message without words. The next day, another package waited on my doorstep. It was identical to the first, same plain brown box, same lack of labels or markings. My pulse quickened as I picked it up, a subtle chill spreading through me even before I opened it. The box felt heavier than the last, a cold, metallic weight inside. I took it indoors, hesitating before lifting the lid. Inside, resting in the center, was a small, old-fashioned key, tarnished and worn. It felt cold, almost unnaturally so, as I held it in my hand, the metal rough beneath my fingers. There was no note, no indication of what the key was for or why it had been sent to me. I set it aside, forcing myself to believe it was just another odd prank, though the creeping chill in my stomach suggested otherwise. In the days that followed, the packages kept coming, each one arriving without a sound, left silently on the doorstep for me to find. Each box held something stranger, each item unsettling in a way that felt deliberate. There was a cracked mirror, the fractured glass gleaming with a warped reflection, a tiny doll, its single eye staring blankly from a hollow face. A scrap of paper with a symbol drawn in red ink, one I didn't recognize but felt oddly disturbed by. Each item felt like a small invasion, a puzzle piece with no clear picture to assemble. And as each day passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that these objects weren't random, that they were meant to send a message I was only beginning to understand. By the end of the week, I was certain someone was watching me. The packages alone were strange enough, but with each new delivery, the feeling intensified, as if someone was out there observing, waiting for me to find their gifts. I'd try to brush it off, tell myself it was all in my head, but the feeling of being watched clung to me, shadowing my every move. At night, the unease grew sharper. I'd hear faint sounds outside, soft tapping against the windows, like someone's fingers brushing the glass, or the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the porch. Each time, I'd look outside, heart hammering, only to find the street empty, the surrounding houses dark and still. It became a nightly ritual, lying awake, straining to hear each tiny noise, the silence between each sound growing heavier, each one feeding into the growing fear settling into my bones. And yet, despite my dread, part of me was compelled to wait, to listen, as if somehow the next sound would bring an answer, reveal the person behind this twisted game. But every morning I'd wake with the same unanswered question. my heart sinking as I found yet another package waiting, as silent and ominous as the last. One night, after an evening filled with restless sleep and half dreams of shadows moving outside, I woke to find something waiting for me inside the house. It was there on the kitchen counter, sitting in plain sight, its edges illuminated by the pale glow of the streetlight side. My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard a sound, hadn't seen any sign of intrusion. And yet, someone had entered my home, placing the package right where I would find it. I stood frozen, staring at the box, my heart pounding as I felt the weight of dread settle over me. The thought that someone had been inside, moving silently through my home while I slept, was almost too much to bear. I forced myself to approach, the air thick with a sense of violation, the kind that clung to my skin, reminding me of how powerless I was in my own home. Inside the box was a broken pocket watch, its glass face cracked, the hands frozen at midnight. Alongside it was a piece of paper, and in shaky, uneven handwriting were the words, "Do you understand now?" They felt like a taunt, a question that demanded an answer I couldn't provide, as if I were missing some crucial piece of a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house setting me on edge, every shadow twisting into shapes in the corners of my mind. I considered calling the police, but the fear of sounding irrational kept me from reaching for the phone. All I had were strange packages and a growing paranoia, no clear threat, nothing concrete. But I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just random objects, that somehow this was personal. After that night, sleep became a distant memory. Every creak, every murmur of the house settling seemed amplified in the silence, my own breathing loud and harsh in the darkness. I'd lie in bed, eyes wide open, heart pounding as I waited for the next sound, the next knock, anything that would reveal what was happening. But each night passed without incident, the hours stretching endlessly, filled with the terrible expectation that something or someone was just out of sight. Each morning, I'd wake feeling hollowed out, the weight of sleeplessness mingling with the steady beat of fear. The house felt different now, its walls closer, each shadow hiding something unseen. I considered calling the police again, but I knew the response would be the same. Without a clear threat, without any real evidence of harm, there was little they could do. And I knew how it would sound. The ravings of a paranoid mind, haunted by packages that anyone else would have brushed off as a prank. But I couldn't brush it off. My life was filled with these objects, these symbols, each one a reminder that someone out there had chosen me. Each one carefully delivered, each message left for me to interpret, to understand. The fear was relentless, a presence that lingered in every corner of my mind, twisting even the smallest sounds into harbingers of something dark and unseen. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the packages stopped. For days I held my breath, expecting to find another box waiting, another item demanding my attention. But none came. I checked the doorstep every morning, my heart racing with anticipation and dread, but each day passed in silence. Even the strange noises, the footsteps, the tapping at the windows, all of it ceased, leaving only an unsettling stillness in their place. At first, I felt a cautious relief, as though I'd somehow escaped a nightmare that had begun to unravel my sanity. But as the days stretched into weeks, the relief turned to something else, a sense of unease that grew with each passing day. The absence felt unnatural, as if the silence itself was a part of the message, a final note in a melody I couldn't hear. Without the packages, without the noises, my mind filled the gaps, turning every shadow into a watcher, every creak into a warning. The silence had become its own form of torture, a constant reminder of the things I didn't know, the things I feared. I'd glance out the window at odd hours, expecting to see someone lurking, watching, but the street was always empty, the house too quiet, as if the whole world had abandoned me to this strange, empty dread. With nothing new happening, I tried to piece together some semblance of normalcy. I went through the motions, returning to routines I hadn't realized I'd missed until the packages had stripped them away. But the memory of each strange object, each cryptic message, clung to me, filling the quiet moments with an invisible weight. I felt haunted, not by the person who had sent the packages, but by the objects themselves, as though each one had left a piece of itself behind, lingering in the corners of my mind. I could go days without thinking about them, convincing myself that it was all over, that I'd been the victim of an elaborate prank, or perhaps someone's twisted idea of a performance. But then a small sound or an unexpected knock would send my heart racing, the fear flooding back in a wave, reminding me that I didn't understand, that I was still living in the shadow of a mystery I couldn't solve. And though no new packages arrived, no new objects appeared, I could feel the weight of them, each feather, each key, each cryptic message echoing in my thoughts. A reminder that someone out there had watched, had known, and had chosen to leave their mark. The night was quiet as I walked home, a kind of calm settling over the empty streets as I took my usual shortcut. The alley was narrow, lined with shadows that seemed to deepen under the flickering streetlights. It wasn't the kind of place most people would go out of their way to pass through, but I'd used it hundreds of times. I knew the twists and turns, the subtle hum of silence it held, the way the shadows played on the walls. As I made my way down the alley, something felt slightly off. It was the silence, heavier than usual, as if even the distant hum of traffic had faded. The streetlights blinked in and out, casting long shadows across the damp pavement, stretching like fingers over the walls. I shrugged it off, quickening my pace slightly, ready to get through and onto the main street where the lights felt brighter, safer. And then, just as I was almost out of the alley, I heard it, a voice calling my name. I stopped, puzzled, listening closely. The voice was unmistakable. It was Sarah calling to me from behind, her tone casual but urgent. I felt my heart jump, surprised and confused. Sarah wouldn't be out here, not at this hour, and certainly not in this part of town. The rational part of me told me it was impossible, but still, I hesitated, curiosity mingling with a twinge of fear. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness behind me. The alley stretched out in eerie silence, empty but for the faint glow of the flickering lights. It felt strange, wrong, to think of Sarah being here. She had no reason to be in this part of town, especially not at this hour, yet her voice drifted through the silence again, calling my name. "Come here! I need your help!" she called, her tone sharp with urgency. But there was something off. Her voice was familiar, yet distant, like a recording being played back just a little slower than normal, or with an undertone I couldn't quite identify. It was enough to make me hesitate, standing there, torn between instinct and the pull of a voice I knew so well. As I listened, an uneasy feeling settled over me, a prickle of doubt crawling up my spine. I'd known Sarah for years. I knew her voice, her inflections, the way she spoke. And yet something about this call felt wrong, like a thin veil masking something deeper, something that didn't belong in that dark alley. Still, I took a step forward, trying to peer into the shadows, straining to see if there was any sign of her. The silence around her voice felt heavy, unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave, but the familiar sound of Sarah's voice kept pulling me forward, drawing me closer. I took another step, moving cautiously, my pulse quickening with each footfall. The silence seemed to press in on me, thick and suffocating, as if every sound had been swallowed up, leaving only her voice. I couldn't hear any footsteps, no shuffling sounds, no hint that someone was actually there. Just her voice, drifting through the shadows, calling to me, steady and clear. It called my name again, the same exact tone, the same inflection, as though it hadn't changed at all since the first time I heard it. The familiarity of it was unsettling, a sound too perfect to be real, too precise to belong to Sarah. The quietness around it only added to my dread, amplifying the growing realization that something was very wrong. I stopped, the chill creeping through me as the voice repeated, echoing off the walls, hanging in the air like a lure. It was then that it hit me. Whatever was calling to me wasn't Sarah. This voice, this sound, was something else entirely, something that had taken on her tone, her words, to pull me in, to draw me deeper into the shadows. A sense of dread washed over me, the weight of fear pressing down as I took a shaky step back, my mind racing to understand what was happening. The voice drifted closer, the same inflection, the same exact words, each repetition chilling in its perfection. Whatever was there, it was mimicking her, playing with the familiarity of her voice to bring me closer. The realization struck like a bolt of ice, freezing me in place for a heartbeat. This wasn't Sarah. Whatever was in that alley was using her voice, using her tone and inflection, trying to lure me toward it. The thought alone sent a surge of panic through me, my pulse racing as I took a step back, the alley around me seeming to close in. Without another thought, I turned and ran. I didn't dare look back, didn't risk another glance into the darkness as I sprinted down the alley, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Behind me, the voice called my name one last time, but I pushed myself harder, forcing my legs to carry me faster, out of the shadows and into the light of the main street. As I reached the street, the world felt brighter, safer. The sounds of distant traffic and streetlights, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence I'd left behind. But even in the safety of the main street, the echo of that voice lingered, chilling me to the core. I didn't stop running until I reached home, the memory of the voice haunting me with every step. Once inside, I locked the door, leaning against it as I caught my breath, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd heard, what had called to me in Sarah's voice. But every attempt only deepened my dread. Desperation took hold as I grabbed my phone and dialed her number, needing to know for certain. I sat there in my living room, still trying to calm my racing heart, when the call connected. I hadn't even noticed how late it was. Sarah's voice answered, groggy and confused, her words blending into a haze as relief washed over me. She was at home, safe and sound, miles away from the alley. I could hear the familiar tone in her voice, the cadence that was unmistakably her, and yet it felt surreal, as if I'd imagined the whole thing. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern as I mumbled something about wanting to check on her. I tried to brush it off, telling her I just had a strange dream. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what had really happened. The words felt too heavy, too unbelievable, even as I replayed the moment in my mind. I ended the call quickly, not wanting to hear more, afraid that each word would echo the memory of the voice in the alley. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it, the sound of her voice, of whatever had called to me in her voice, stayed with me. I could almost feel it, lingering in the corners of the room, filling the silence with a chilling familiarity that set my nerves on edge. The fear I'd felt in the alley hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger, burrowing deeper, as though the voice had somehow found its way inside. Over the next few days, I avoided telling anyone about what happened, not even Sarah. Every time I tried to bring it up, the words stuck in my throat, too surreal to share. Part of me felt silly, convinced that saying it out loud would make me sound paranoid, delusional even. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I could see that alley, feel the cold dread that had settled over me the moment I realized the voice wasn't hers. At night, I'd lie awake, each creak of the house making my pulse quicken, each shadow shifting just beyond my vision. I found myself glancing at my phone, tempted to call her again just to reassure myself, to hear the real Sarah, the real voice. But every time I did, that same memory would surface. The voice that called to me with her exact tone, her exact words, repeating my name in a way that no real person ever would. In my heart, I knew it was real. Whatever had been in that alley wasn't Sarah, and yet it had known her voice, her mannerisms, had used her familiarity as a lure. The thought left a weight in my chest, a fear that tightened its grip on me each day, refusing to let go. As days turned into nights, sleep became a distant memory. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come, but all I felt was that same dread, as though the voice had somehow followed me home. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my room, and small noises became whispers, echoes of Sarah's voice calling my name, urging me closer. Even though I knew it was just my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was worse in the silence. The quieter it became, the louder the memory grew, filling my mind with the unmistakable sound of her voice, calling from the dark. I'd catch myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing outside, waiting, watching. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't help it. I was living in the shadow of that night, haunted by the knowledge that something out there could mimic the people I trusted most. I avoided the alley at all costs, refusing to take the shortcut that had once felt so familiar. but the fear stayed with me, a presence that clung to my every step, reminding me that I'd been chosen, marked in some inexplicable way. Sam had always been the life of the party on social media. His feed was a steady stream of laughs, inside jokes, and snapshots from his travels. Typical, harmless stuff. So when I first saw his post take a darker turn, I didn't think too much of it. We all go through phases, right? I figured he was just experimenting, trying to add some edge to his profile. But as the days passed, something about his post started gnawing at me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. The captions were the first thing I noticed. Short, cryptic lines like "almost there" or "I see it now." They sounded like a countdown, like he was working towards something, but he left no explanation, no context. Then the photos started changing too. Grainy shots of empty, dimly lit streets, dimly illuminated rooms, objects that looked abstract and unfamiliar. They were unsettling, like scenes from a bad dream. I found myself scrolling back through his feed late at night, tracing the shift in tone, each post stranger than the last. None of the places looked familiar or like anything Sam would normally go near. It was as if he'd slipped into a world that only he could see. Not long after the photos began, I started receiving messages from him late at night. They'd pop up out of nowhere, often just a few words, "Do you hear them?" or "Stay away from the dark places." They were vague, clipped, almost robotic, and whenever I tried to reply, he'd either ignore it or send something equally cryptic like, "They're getting closer." I couldn't make sense of any of it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, or he was pulling some elaborate social experiment. But as the messages kept coming, each one stranger than the last, I began to feel a real sense of unease. It was like I was talking to a stranger, someone wearing Sam's face, but who was nothing like him. The Sam I knew would never send something like this. I felt helpless, staring at the screen, knowing my friend was out there, slipping further and further away from reality, and I couldn't reach him. Worried, I reached out to some mutual friends, hoping they'd have answers. They'd noticed it too, the shift in his posts, the eerie, detached vibe he'd been giving off. One friend mentioned that Sam had been missing from our usual gatherings, only showing up a few times, and even then, he'd been quiet, distant. When he was there, it was like his mind was somewhere else. A couple of them had tried talking to him, asking if something was wrong, but he brushed it off, acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. We shared stories of our last interactions with him, each one stranger than the last. One friend recalled Sam mumbling something about seeing the other side before he wandered off into the night, leaving us all on edge. Another mentioned a bizarre text they'd received at 3 in the morning, a single line that read, "I can't stop them." We started to wonder if Sam was in some sort of trouble, but none of us knew what to do. We were left with a collective sense of dread, feeling him slipping away from all of us without any way to pull him back. Then, late one night, I received another message from Sam. It wasn't a text this time, but a photo. My screen lit up, displaying an image of his bedroom. The photo was dim, almost pitch black, with just the faint outline of his bed and a shadow cast on the wall. My heart began to pound as I studied the image, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. There was something deeply unsettling about the shadow, like it didn't belong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Beneath the photo was a caption, just 4 words, "It's getting closer." I knew then that I had to go to his place. My mind raced, thinking of every possible explanation, none of them good. I felt the same dread I'd been feeling for weeks, amplified now, an urgent need to see him, to make sure he was all right. Ignoring the lateness of the hour, I grabbed my keys and headed out, hoping I wasn't too late. I arrived at Sam's apartment with a sense of urgency, my mind buzzing with questions. As I walked up to his door, I noticed how eerily silent the building was, as if it were holding its breath. I knocked, the sound echoing in the hallway, but there was no answer. After waiting a few moments, I tried the doorknob, surprised to find it unlocked. I pushed the door open, stepping into the dark, empty apartment. A chill settled over me as I looked around, realizing there was nothing left. No furniture, no belongings, not even a trace of Sam's life. The emptiness of the room felt wrong, almost hollow. I tried to rationalize it, Maybe he'd left in a hurry, maybe he hadn't had time to tell anyone, but it didn't add up. Sam wouldn't have moved without saying a word, without at least leaving a sign of where he'd gone. As I stood there, struggling to make sense of it, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I spun around, but the apartment was still empty as before. Then, a low hum, my phone buzzing in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart racing, and saw a new notification from Sam's account. I opened the notification, my hands trembling. The image was dark and close-up, a blurred shot of a face, eyes wide open, staring directly into the camera. It was hard to tell who it was, the details too distorted, but something about those eyes felt disturbingly familiar. I couldn't shake the feeling that they belonged to Sam, his gaze filled with terror and a silent plea I couldn't understand. The caption read, "I'll be seeing you soon." My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, feeling a creeping dread settle in. It was like a warning, as if whatever had consumed Sam was now watching me, marking me somehow. I backed out of the photo, scrolling through his profile, but everything else was gone. No posts, no messages, just the empty shell of an account. I felt trapped in that moment, realizing that I might be staring into the last remnants of Sam's life, captured in that one haunting image. The days that followed were filled with a heavy, oppressive silence. Sam's account went completely inactive after that night. I tried reaching out, sending messages, even leaving voicemails, but there was no response. I wasn't the only one concerned. Our friends started calling too, worried about his sudden disappearance, wondering if anyone had seen or heard from him. But Sam had vanished, leaving no trace, no explanation. The police were eventually involved, but even they turned up empty-handed. There were no records of him moving, no forwarding address, no financial activity, nothing that suggested where he might have gone. It was as if he'd been erased, leaving only those last eerie posts. Days turned to weeks, and with no updates, our group of friends began to accept the unthinkable, that we might never see Sam again. The account, once filled with his life and memories, remained frozen, untouched, until one day it was deleted without warning, erasing his digital presence entirely. It was as if he'd never been there at all. In the months that followed, I tried to move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every so often, I'd receive a friend request from a blank account, no profile picture, no posts. The first time it happened, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The username was gibberish, just a random string of letters and numbers, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was him. Each request felt like a shadow of Sam, a ghostly reminder of the friend I'd lost. It was late, close to midnight, and the quiet of my apartment had settled into a comfortable calm. The neighborhood was always still at this hour, the occasional hum of a distant car or faint rustling of leaves outside the only sounds. So when I heard a knock at the door, sharp and deliberate, I froze. My heart immediately picked up, and I sat up, trying to rationalize it. I wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors at this hour were unusual. I waited, hoping that maybe it was just a mistake, that whoever it was would realize they had the wrong door. But after a long silence, curiosity got the better of me. I moved quietly to the door, my hand reaching out for the peephole, pressing my eye to it. A man stood there, alone. He was well dressed, in a dark coat that seemed almost too formal for the hour. He looked like he was on his way home from an event, or maybe just passing through. But something about his posture, the way he stood so still, hands calmly by his sides looking straight at my door, unnerved me. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to open it. But then, against my better judgment, I cracked the door open just enough to ask what he wanted. He looked at me, his face calm, yet there was something in his eyes, an intensity that made me regret opening the door. "Is Mark here?" he asked, his tone so casual that for a moment it felt like a normal encounter. But the question didn't make sense. I didn't know anyone named Mark, and as far as I knew, no one by that name had ever lived in this apartment. "No, I think you have the wrong address," I said, keeping my voice steady. I half expected him to apologize and leave, but he didn't budge. He just looked at me, his expression unchanging, as if waiting for me to say something else. There was a pause, and then he tilted his head slightly. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice soft but firm, as though he didn't believe me. The question unsettled me. His tone wasn't questioning, it was challenging, as if he knew something I didn't. My fingers tightened on the edge of the door. I repeated that there was no mark here, hoping he would finally take the hint and leave. But he didn't move. He kept his gaze fixed on me, that same calm, unyielding stare that felt almost like a test. After a moment, he took a small step forward, bringing himself closer to the door. "Mark told me to meet him here," he said, his voice low and deliberate, as if he were explaining something simple that I should already know. He said this was the place. My pulse quickened, my skin prickling with a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. This wasn't normal. I tried to close the door, feeling a rising urge to put a barrier between us, but he moved his hand to the doorframe, keeping it open. His grip was firm, his fingers pressing into the wood. I opened my mouth to tell him to leave, but my voice faltered, caught in my throat. Something about him, his calm insistence, his steady gaze, it all felt wrong, like he knew I couldn't refuse him. I repeated, more firmly this time, that there was no one named Mark here, that he needed to leave. But he just gave me a faint smile, a slow, unsettling curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. I felt a wave of nausea, the kind that hits you when you sense danger but can't make sense of it. His smile lingered, his gaze unwavering, and then he spoke again, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Well, if you're not Mark," he asked, his tone holding a strange, unsettling curiosity, "then who are you?" The way he asked it, so casually yet loaded with something dark, sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't an ordinary question. It felt invasive, as though he were peeling back layers, trying to see something hidden beneath. I stared at him, momentarily paralyzed, unsure of how to respond, feeling exposed under his unblinking stare. My hand moved instinctively, pushing the door shut with a force I hadn't realized I was capable of. I turned the lock, the metal clicking into place, and stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. For a few seconds, I stayed frozen, pressing my ear to the door, barely breathing, listening. But there was only silence. I couldn't resist looking through the peephole again, and there he was, still standing outside, his expression unreadable, as if he could see me watching him. He lingered for what felt like an eternity, then took a step back, his gaze fixed on the door as if waiting for it to open again. Finally, after a long moment, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. But I didn't feel any relief. I stood by the door, the silence oppressive, knowing that something about this encounter would haunt me long after he was gone. That night, sleep was a distant prospect. Every sound outside my door felt amplified. The creak of the building settling, the hum of pipes in the walls, the faint ticking of the clock. Each noise seemed to carry the possibility that he might return. I lay awake, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, analyzing every word, every look, searching for some reasonable explanation. But nothing made sense. There was no Mark, no reason he should have been there, and no logical reason he'd reacted as if I were lying to him. As the hours wore on, exhaustion finally took over, but my sleep was restless, haunted by vague, disjointed dreams of standing at the door, the man on the other side, his eyes unblinking, watching me. I woke up to the first rays of morning light, feeling an unease that wouldn't leave, as if his presence had lingered in the room overnight. I forced myself out of bed, convincing myself that it was over, that he was gone. But as I walked to the door, preparing to shake off the night, my stomach dropped at the sight of something on the floor. A note had been slipped under the door, a small piece of paper with neatly written words. My pulse quickened as I knelt down to pick it up, my eyes catching on the precise handwriting. It read, "Tell Mark I'll be back." My hands trembled as I held the note, reading and rereading those 4 words, hoping that I'd somehow misinterpreted them. But there was no mistake. The stranger had left this behind, confirming that he wasn't just passing through, that his visit wasn't a simple error. He knew my address, knew I'd been there, and worse, he intended to come back. A cold fear washed over me, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? Why was he looking for Mark here, and why was he so sure he'd find him? The sense of invasion was overwhelming. This was my home, my sanctuary, yet he'd slipped in like a shadow, leaving a reminder that he was never far. I thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but what would I say? That a stranger had knocked on my door and left a note? That he'd been looking for someone who didn't exist? I could already imagine their reaction. A polite dismissal, nothing they could do. So I crumpled the note, throwing it in the trash, trying to bury the memory of it along with the paper. But the words lingered in my mind, echoing with a promise I couldn't escape. I'll be back. The following days were a haze of paranoia and vigilance. I'd find myself checking the locks on my door multiple times each night, lingering by the peephole, listening for any sign that he might have returned. Every creak in the hallway, every distant footstep sent a jolt through me. Rationally, I knew it was pointless. No one just stood outside someone's door waiting to be noticed. But the encounter had shaken me, left me feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt before. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Walking down the street, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, that same unsettling stare fixed on me. Friends and coworkers noticed my distraction, asking if I was okay, if something was wrong, but I brushed them off, not wanting to sound paranoid. After all, what could I say? That a stranger had appeared at my door, refused to leave, and now I couldn't shake the feeling he was waiting to return? I kept it to myself, hoping that time would fade the memory, that eventually I'd be able to sleep without keeping one ear open, listening for that familiar knock. Weeks passed and life slowly began to settle back into its usual rhythm. I'd almost convinced myself that he wasn't coming back, that maybe the whole encounter had been a strange mistake, one that he'd since forgotten. I forced myself to relax, to stop checking the door obsessively, telling myself it was over. The apartment door creaked as I stepped inside, and the scent of stale air hit me first, a mix of dust, old wood, and a strange underlying musk that seemed to cling to the walls. The place looked like it had been forgotten, as though time had frozen everything in the exact state it had left. I was hired for jobs like this, old apartments about to go up for rent, usually neglected for months, sometimes years. I'd been in places that looked worse, dirtier, and with far more stubborn grime. But there was something about this place that felt different. It was the quiet, the heaviness in the air, or maybe just the emptiness, with only a few pieces of furniture left behind, as if they'd been abandoned. As I moved through the rooms, dust rose up, catching in the rays of light from the windows. Everything was covered in a thin layer of it, untouched for who knows how long. I mentally mapped out my plan: clean each room top to bottom, scrub down surfaces, and finally tackle the floor in the living room, where I'd already spotted a strange dark blotch. Stains were routine for me. I didn't think much of them. I dealt with all kinds, from spilled wine to paint smudges, even old ink spills that had seemed like they'd seeped into the soul of the wood. I set down my supplies in the living room, where that stain was waiting, dark and irregular against the faded floorboards. I approached it, noticing its shape was unlike any stain I'd seen before. It didn't spread out evenly. It twisted into the wood as if it had seeped down through the layers. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that the mark was almost deliberate, but I dismissed it as nonsense. After all, it was just another stain, one that I'd surely lift in no time. I kneeled down, pulling out my standard cleaner, the kind I usually start with. The liquid beaded on the dark surface, pooling along the edges of the stain. I scrubbed lightly at first, figuring the wood would be delicate after years of neglect. But as I pressed harder, I could feel the resistance, as if the wood itself was pushing back against my efforts. No matter how many circles I made with the sponge, the stain barely lightened. I frowned, leaning back, observing it under the natural light. It was almost as if the stain had a grip on the wood, rooted deep down and not just on the surface. I moved to stronger cleaners, still hesitant to press too hard but determined to see some result. Minutes passed, then an hour. I tried angle after angle, hitting it with scrubs, sponges, and even a coarse brush I'd brought for particularly stubborn spots. My arm ached, but the stain remained as dark as ever, seemingly untouched by my efforts. I leaned back on my heels, staring at it, that unsettling thought creeping back. This wasn't a normal stain. When I stood to stretch, I glanced away for just a second. But when I looked back, it felt as if the stain had deepened, growing somehow darker and sharper against the floorboards. I shook my head, brushing it off as a trick of the light or my own frustration. Still, a tiny part of me wondered what could be strong enough to leave a mark that would withstand everything I had thrown at it. After taking a quick break to gather my patience, I rummaged through my supplies for something more powerful. I didn't usually go for the heavy-duty chemicals unless absolutely necessary, but this seemed like one of those times. The label warned against prolonged exposure, so I opened a window, letting the stale air swirl out into the autumn breeze. I poured the thick, almost oily liquid onto the stain, watching as it sank slowly into the wood. I braced myself, scrubbing hard and steady, pressing down with every ounce of strength I had left. For a moment, just a brief second, I thought I saw a change. The stain appeared to lighten, fading slightly as the cleaner did its work. Relief washed over me. Maybe I had finally cracked the code to this mark. I turned away to grab a cloth, ready to finish up. But when I looked back, the stain was there, just as dark, as if it hadn't budged at all. A chill swept down my spine as I realized I'd made no progress. I shook my head, telling myself it was just an illusion, something to do with the cleaner evaporating, or maybe just my eyes playing tricks on me. But the room felt heavier, like the walls were closing in just a little more. And then, almost imperceptibly, I caught a whiff of something strange, a metallic, damp smell that seemed to seep up from the floor, mingling with the musty air. It was faint, but it was enough to make me pause, hands frozen, cloth in hand. I didn't know where it came from, but it made my skin crawl. The strange smell lingered, hanging in the air like a weight pressing down on me. As I worked, I couldn't shake the growing sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was there with me, watching. The room, once just an empty, dusty space, now felt alive in a way I couldn't quite explain. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker, making it hard to breathe deeply, without that metallic tang scraping against my throat. I focused back on the stain, determined to make some headway, but each time I looked at it, it seemed darker, almost as if it were spreading, consuming more of the floor. My supplies felt useless in my hands, the strongest chemicals I had brought now seeming weak against whatever this stain truly was. I pushed down the rising feeling of unease, telling myself it was all in my head, that this was just an old apartment with an old, stubborn mark. But the cold around me grew more intense, and the smell was becoming unbearable, sinking deep into my lungs with each breath. I felt as if something beneath the floorboards was resisting, a force pushing up against me, keeping the stain rooted in place. I wanted to stop, to pack up and leave, but something compelled me to keep going. It was as if the room itself was challenging me, waiting to see how much I could take. I felt a strange, desperate urge to rid the floor of this mark, almost as if my own sanity depended on it. I grabbed the strongest cleaner I had left, a harsh, pungent solution that could strip paint, and poured it directly onto the stain. The liquid pooled in dark rivulets, soaking into the wood as if being absorbed by some hidden layer below. I attacked it with renewed intensity, scrubbing until my muscles burned, pushing with every ounce of energy I had left. The brush scraped against the wood, filling the room with an acrid scent, mixing with the stale metallic odor that had become almost suffocating. For a moment, the stain seemed to relent, its edges blurring as if weakening under my relentless scrubbing. I felt a glimmer of hope, thinking I might finally be winning. But as I paused to wipe my forehead, I glanced down and saw it again, darker, more pronounced, as if mocking my efforts. My hands shook, the cold sweat gathering on my palms. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a stain. It was something far deeper, something alive, resisting my every effort. I pressed harder, almost in a frenzy, my thoughts jumbled, logic slipping as the hours dragged on. But it was futile. The mark refused to disappear. By now, exhaustion had seeped into my bones, my body aching from hours of futile scrubbing. The room around me felt darker, the late afternoon light fading, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist along the floor. My chest tightened with each breath, the stale air thick and oppressive, weighing on me. Every time I glanced at the stain, it seemed to pulse, as if alive, like something beneath the floor was pressing upward, making itself known. I stopped, standing back, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me. It felt as if the apartment was watching me, that I was intruding on something ancient and unwilling to be disturbed. The smell in the room intensified, sharp and metallic, filling my lungs, scraping against the back of my throat. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to abandon the job and get out, but something in me resisted. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the strange pull of that stain, holding me there, urging me to keep going. The longer I stayed, the stronger the sense of something lurking beneath the floor became. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a steady, almost rhythmic pulse just beneath the surface, as if it were breathing in tandem with my own. My hand hovered over the mark, fingers grazing the wood, feeling a faint vibration beneath. Panic clawed at my chest, cold and suffocating, but my curiosity held me still, rooted to the spot. The apartment seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter, the silence heavier. I felt a chill prickling at the back of my neck, the air so cold it stung my skin. The strange smell, metallic and damp, was overpowering now, making my stomach turn with each shallow breath. I knew I should leave, that nothing good could come from staying any longer, but something deep inside held me captive. I stayed, staring down at the mark, knowing it wanted me to. In one final, desperate attempt, I poured the last of my chemicals onto the stain, attacking it with a ferocity I didn't know I had left. The brush scraped harshly against the wood, each stroke feeling like a battle, my own sanity slipping with each pass. And for a brief, fleeting moment, the mark seemed to fade, almost disappearing entirely. Relief surged through me, a wave of victory washing over my exhausted body.